We've made it to almost the end of the semester, so congratulations to everybody. It's a great day for the Faculty Senate in that we get to have our distinguished faculty lecture this afternoon. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. Karida Brown. Dr. Brown is a sociologist, a professor, an oral historian, and public intellectual whose research centers on the fullness, and I would ad-lib here and say beauty, of Black life. She is a proud graduate of Temple University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Brown University. Previously, she held positions as professor of sociology at UCLA. She was the inaugural director of the Racial Equity and Action at the LA Lakers. And she's the inaugural Diane Nash Descendants of Emancipation Chair at Fisk University. Currently, Dr. Brown serves as professor of sociology here at Emory University. She's the author of several books, including most recently the New Brownies book, A Love Letter to Black Families, which very recently received the 55th annual NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work in Nonfiction. Her next book, Battle for the Black Mind, is forthcoming with Legacy Lit by Hatchet Book Group. Dr. Brown resides in Atlanta, Georgia, with her husband, the artist Charlie Palmer, and their 2 pugs. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Karida Brown.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, y'all. Good afternoon. That's a good end of the semester greeting. I appreciate that. So hello, colleagues, friends, family. It is a great honor to be invited to come here and deliver the Emory College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Faculty Lecture. Thank you all. So it is my second year here at Emory University, and I have to tell you that it has just been a tremendous joy for me, and I want to tell you that it is an honor to call each of you colleagues, so thank you for that. So I want to start off by just taking you to a place that is very much a part of my origin story as a scholar and as a person, okay? So here we have a photo of the Lynch-colored public school building. This is a photo that I took while on a research trip about 10 years ago in 2014. And while the school is closed now, it was once bustling in the center of this little community in Lynch, Kentucky, located up in the Appalachian Mountains of Harlan County, Kentucky. Lynch, Kentucky is a ghost town now, but it once boasted a population of over 10,000 families, and it was a racially and ethnically diverse community. It was also a company-owned town, so this entire town was owned by United States Steel Corporation, so a company-owned coal town. However, Lynch, Kentucky did not escape the long arm of Jim Crow. So the state of Kentucky, like all other states across the US South, had legal mandates making it illegal for white and black children to attend school together. And the school system in Lynch was no different. In 1963, almost a full decade after Brown versus Board of Education was passed, the Lynch Colored School graduated its last class. And the black kids went up to the white school. That's how they like to say it. So they and millions of black youth across the country carried out the desegregation mandate. They did this whether they wanted to or not. And I want to remind you that their teachers, for the most part, couldn't come with them. Their parents could not come with them. The legions of activists, protesters, lawmakers who went to court to make sure that this decision was passed down couldn't do the thing that those young children had to do. I've published many pieces of scholarship about this very school and Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation. But I have a closer connection to this place because my mother and father attended this school, as did my 25 aunts and uncles from both sides of their families. We come from really big families, y'all. My grandmother also attended this school, so I have an intergenerational relationship with this place, okay? And because of this, I dedicate this distinguished faculty lecture to my mother and father, Richard and Karida Brown, who are sitting in the back of the room here. And I also dedicate this lecture to the millions of African-American children of integration. That is that entire generation of Black youth across the country who helped to perfect the nation by desegregating our public school systems. This is a historic moment, and it couldn't be a more fitting time for me to share this research with you, because May 17th, 1 month from today, marks the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. It is because of that landmark Supreme Court decision that all of us are able to be in this space together, okay? Brown legally mandated the desegregation of public schools in America, but it did so much more. It was the crack that opened the gates for a deluge of civil rights laws to come through, both in legislation and executive orders, everything from voting rights to affirmative action and everything in between. I must emphasize that Brown versus Board of Education did not just benefit Black Americans. It made explicit inroads for equal opportunities for all other racial minorities, for all immigrant groups, and for all women, okay? So in just 70 years, y'all, come on now, look at how the pendulum has swung. Can you believe where we are? We are now entering a new era of exclusion in America. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end, but before I get to that, I want to tell you a story about the century of separate and unequal schooling that we had right here in this country. I'm talking about the 100 years leading up to Brown. My research has been centered on one basic question. Having passed this school so many times as a little kid when my parents would bring me up to Lynch, Kentucky to visit my grandparents, and coming into the knowledge of, what this school symbolized as an ugly marker of our history. Alex, the slides are not transitioning. I think it's due to the Zoom. But I digress. So my research has centered on one question. What even is a colored school? Like, think about that. What is a colored school? What were the educational philosophies that undergirded these systems? Who created them? And what aims did they have for Black education? I also want to know, how did Black folks who attended these schools, educated at these institutions, and shaped their communities through education, how did they enact their own freedom dreams through education? So in sum, my forthcoming book with Legacy Lit is titled Battle for the Black Mind, and it is a deep investigation into the political economy of Black education before Brown. Y'all want to hear a story? Okay, let's do it. So I want to ground this talk in a set of ideologies that we're all pretty familiar with in this room, but it's a tale worth twice telling. So I want to talk a little bit about scientific racism in progressive era sociology. because I am a sociologist and I also am a petty Betty, I really enjoyed investigating my own discipline and its relationship to this era. And I was surprised to find such direct and concrete linkages between sociology and Black education. So I want to introduce you to Franklin Giddens. He was an American sociologist. He is noted in our discipline as one of the founding fathers of American sociology. To get a moniker like that, you need to do a couple things. So Franklin Giddens started a school of sociology, meaning that he had a distinct approach to social science research that he coined. And this was marked by two things. One was a theoretical contribution of consciousness of kind. And that basically boils down to birds of a feather stick together. And that was what he used to explain all manner of inequality and inequity that he was looking at in the world. He also really relied on and innovated around evolutionary empiricism, meaning that he combined social Darwinism, these theories of evolution, with quantitative research. So he was a pioneer in demonstrating quantitatively why we have racial and ethnic difference in the US. Okay? He also trained a generation of graduate students. So Franklin Giddens had over 50 graduate students during his time at Columbia Sociology, where he served as the first full professor in that department. And I want to show you just a little bit about what this evolutionary empiricism looked like in action. Here's an excerpt from one of his early publications. This was a sociology textbook, Readings in Descriptive Historical Sociology, published in 1906. I'm going to read this for you, and I just want you to imagine your students reading and learning from this given text. Despite the past 500 years, the people of the heat belt have added nothing whatsoever to what we understand by human advancement. Those natives of the tropics and subtropics who have not been under direct European influence have not during that time made a single contribution of first importance. Let me list this for y'all all. For art, literature, science, manufactures, or inventions. They have not produced an engineer or a chemist, a biologist or a historian, or a painter or a musician of the first rank. What did he mean by the heat belt? This pretty much included all nation states across the world, all regions across the world, with the exception of the United States, Australia, Japan, and European countries. And what might they all have in common? Okay? Nobody else contributed anything to human society. And these ideas reproduce themselves through his students. Again, he had a generation of graduate students that he trained. I want to introduce you to one of his star students, Thomas Jesse Jones. He earned his PhD in sociology from Columbia in the early 1900s, and he was Franklin Giddens' student and protege. It's important to know about Jones. He was an immigrant from Wales, and he self-described himself as swarthy. He was referring to his skin color he thought was a little darker than he would have liked, and he never was able to shake his accent. And for that, he was really bothered by that his entire life and dedicated a lot of his research to white ethnic assimilation into an Anglo-Saxon ideal. In fact, that was the topic of his dissertation, where he focused on assimilation practices of Italian American, Jewish American, and Irish American immigrants in New York City. He was an advanced quantitative sociologist, and when he graduated from Columbia, he immediately got a job offer from a little school in Virginia called Hampton Institute. Okay, so we all know Hampton as a historically black college and university, but at the time, these schools were the only institutions of higher education available to African Americans at the time. So Jones accepts the offer to go to Hampton University, and while on faculty there, he also gets appointed to various prestigious positions, including serving as the lead statistician for Negro statistics for the 1910 census. So here's Samuel Chapman Armstrong. He was the first principal of Hampton Institute. He is known for many contributions in his life. He was a general in the Union Army, where he led African American troops during the Civil War. He had a strong conviction for being like a savior for his newly freed fellow citizens. And he had a passion for education. He's the child of two missionaries who settled in Hawaii, where he was actually born. Samuel Chapman Armstrong's father is known as the father of American education in Hawaii. He took some of these ideas from his dad. His father had developed a curricula of adapted education. He thought a lot about how indigenous Hawaiian children needed to be civilized through education. He incorporated a lot of tenets about rote work, repetition, doing and not thinking, and Samuel Armstrong was an apple that didn't fall very far from the tree. So after the Civil War, he's appointed by the American Missionary Association as the first principal of Hampton Institute, and he develops an adapted curricula for African Americans. And it looks very much like the curricula of his father's. And here we have Booker T. Washington, who was Armstrong's star student and protege. So much so that when Booker T. Washington graduates from Hampton University, Armstrong advocates for him to be appointed to a position as a principal of a new institution of higher education in Tuskegee, Alabama, the Tuskegee Institute. Okay, so with just 5 years of education, and I'm talking all the way through, from primary school through, yes, Karen, I see your mouth dropping, from primary school and his 3 years at Hampton Institute, he becomes the president of a university. But Booker T. Washington embodied Armstrong's adapted education model, and between the birth of Hampton and Tuskegee, we have the invention of the Hampton-Tuskegee industrial model of education. They become the poster children of what an acceptable curricula for African Americans looks like. Here are some photos from Hampton and Tuskegee. The curricula was very gendered, so the curricula for women was focused on domestic labor. So here we have a home economics class, and the classes for men were focused on manual labor and agriculture. I want to give you a sense of what a school day looked like for a typical Hampton or Tuskegee student. So class would start at about 5 a.m., so before the sun rises, and you'd have about an hour of class time with your professor, right? After that hour's up, by 6 o'clock, it's time to go to work. The classroom was the campus. So students would work farming, building the bricks for the school, to build the buildings for the school, growing crops, fixing the food, serving the staff. They were being trained for life, or at least the life that the school principals thought was suitable for them. At 5 o'clock, they'd have a small dinner and then have an hour of training, classroom training after that. So about 2 hours of formal classroom education a day and 12 hours of laboring, right? And when I say domestic labor and agriculture, I'm not talking about agricultural science like we might think of for a land-grant school for today. I'm talking about service, being back in the field, something that looks like being a sharecropper and or a domestic servant in a household. And that was the basis of the curricula. And scholars have long argued that the Hampton idea served as an ideological apparatus aimed to prime Black folks to aspire to exist contentedly within their place at the bottom of a global racial caste. Okay, this was ideological, y'all. And there's decades of scholarship that supports this, and I've just noted a few of the texts that have been seminal for my understanding as foundational to this research. But the Hampton-Tuskegee model wasn't the only model out there for curricula. There were many schools that started to pop up that followed a liberal education model, and 3 right here down the street in our own Atlanta, Morehouse, Spelman, and Atlanta University, also founded by religious denominational organizations. Each of these HBCUs were founded on broad liberal curriculum models. So it was typical for students to take classes in physics and literature, Greek and Latin, sociology, history, and politics. They would also have opportunities to learn trades if they wanted to as well. And these schools that followed a liberal model were not limited to institutions of higher education. There were also hundreds, if not thousands, of K through 12 primary schools that started to pop up with their own ideas and visions for what Black education should be. One example I have to share with you is the Haynes Normal Institute that was founded in 1884 by Lucy Craft Laney. This school was founded in Augusta, Georgia. And Laney was just a visionary and ahead of her time. She was born in 1854. However, her parents had negotiated and wrenched their freedom away before the Civil War ended. So Lucy was never enslaved. Lucy learned how to read as a young child, and Lucy got to go to school. She got a full K through 12 education. And she enrolled in the very first class of Atlanta University, even before W.E.B. Du Bois got there as a professor. She took this educational arsenal that she had with her and established her own school. She did not trust the public school system to do right by African American children, so she raised funds independently to start her school. And the curricula there was so broad, and it looked very much like it would rival any New England college or university at the time. There were other Black school founders who had broad visions for Black education, who saw their freedom dreams in setting up independent, autonomous Black schools for themselves. Another example is Mary McLeod Bethune. So she actually apprenticed for 1 year with Lucy Craft Laney at Haynes Institute, so she could learn the tricks of the trade. And then she went out to Daytona, Florida, and started her own Black segregated school, the Daytona Educational and Industrial Training School for Girls. It soon became a co-ed school. It soon went from being an elementary school all the way up to a high school and a nursing school, and it is today still standing as Bethune-Cookman College. Before I move on to the next example, can we please just admire her fur coat that she's serving us here? I mean, it's incredible. And what she's holding in her hand, that cane, President Roosevelt gifted her that cane because she and Eleanor Roosevelt were besties. Okay, so she had great political influence and used that to fundraise and bring attention and resources to her school. A third example that I'll share, and again, just the fashion of it all, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who is raised in Boston, Massachusetts in the late 1800s, decides that she wants to also become not only a school teacher, but a school founder. Why? Because she hears a speech by Booker T. Washington at her church as a young girl, and then she sees a painting of Lucy Craft Laney unveiled at one of her schools. And those two things stuck in her mind, and she felt like she had her mandate. She moved to Sedalia, North Carolina, and founded the Palmer Institute, which at the end of its days ended up being a finishing school for the Black elite in America. So African American families from across the country would send their children to Sedalia for boarding school before they went off into their life in society. So this just shows the heterogeneity of Black political thought as expressed through educational institutions, and that there was no one answer about what this landscape should look like, but nonetheless they're fighting against the backdrop of this Hampton-Tuskegee model. Let me talk to you a little bit about how American philanthropy fits into this ecosystem. I was surprised to find that the first big philanthropies, as we would know them today in the United States, were all focused on Southern education, primarily on Black education in the South. So these are the first two philanthropic organizations that were endowed with $1 million or more. The Slater Fund was one that focused specifically 100% on African Americans. It had an original endowment of $1 million, which would be about $25 million today. And so important was Black education and the control of the Black mind to the American psyche that a former sitting president, Rutherford B. Hayes, became the chairperson of the Slater Fund. So he comes out of retirement to lead this effort. And who does he hire as his philanthropic agent? Y'all know who this is? Oh, okay. So Dr. Atticus G. Haygood, president of Emory College, a very esteemed Methodist bishop, author and scholar. He wrote this book, Our Brother in Black, which was considered radical in his day. If you can just imagine a white scholar publishing a book suggesting any kind of brotherhood in a post-Reconstruction Southern context. So he was really considered, if not only a progressive, a white radical. And he was the first agent of the Slater Fund. He had a quirky personality, and he was so passionate about Emory College. He really loved this institution, and he was known for taking money out of his own pocket to support students, to pay their tuition where there were gaps, and even to put a little money in the coffers of the university. I know that we have the privilege of entering into these beautiful marble buildings when we come onto campus, but just imagine, in the aftermath of the Civil War, almost all institutions across the South were in dire straits, Emory College included, to the extent that Emory was in trouble for almost going into bankruptcy. So Haygood takes this position so that he can do both. He wants to be the president and be the agent for the Slater Fund so he can raise money, but the board members of the Slater Fund wanted him full time. And he says, I can't just abandon Emory like that, it needs me. So they strike a deal. Here is a record from our university archives, a board meeting in 1884, where Haygood delivers his letter of resignation. And he was like, a little cheeky about it. He writes so beautifully and so enthusiastically. I am grateful to God that I am at this time able to announce to the board that through the generosity of a Northern gentleman connected with the work of the John F. Slater Fund, I am able to make full provision for the speedy payment of every debt of Emory College. That's his letter of resignation. So he makes this deal. He makes this deal for an Emory bailout. And this is not to put Emory or any other institution on the spot. It's to show those connections, because remember, I'm talking about a political economy. The people, ideas, institutions, policies, all of that goes into creating a landscape, a political landscape in which we all have to navigate. Had he not struck this deal, I don't know that we'd be sitting in this university today, because I don't know if Emory would have made it, okay? But at what cost? Towards the wholesale underdevelopment of Black education, because one of the mandates in the charter of the Slater Foundation was that any school that they supported had to support what? The Hampton-Tuskegee model of industrial education. What a trade-off. Here are some landmarks to Haygood on our campuses that stand today. So then, after the Slater Fund and the Peabody Foundation are established, we see a slew of philanthropic organizations that begin to pop up, mainly based in the Northeast. Here's a visual that kind of just gives you a representation of the size by endowment. And all of these institutions have either a full mandate or something specific geared towards the development of African American schooling and the education system, all of them in support of the Hampton-Tuskegee model of industrial education. So we're starting to see that this wasn't just a set of ideas, but more of a network that's embedded in a set of power structures. And I want to just tell you a little bit about one of these foundations, the Phelps-Stokes Fund. It was the first foundation of its kind to have an international mandate. So they were interested in the education of, quote, Negroes, and both in Africa and the United States, North American Indians, and needing and deserving white students. So that was the focus, and following the model of the Slater Fund, they too wanted this philanthropic agent to be the one deputized with the power of the institution, and also the one shaping the narrative around how the giving was going. However, we start to see at the turn of the 20th century a focus on wanting a social scientist as that philanthropic agent. Why? Because social scientists make it not just opinion, not just ideology. Now we're doing this because it's science. And science then gets to shape policy, okay? So we see an augmentation of power through this institutional structure. And the Phelps-Stokes Fund put out an application for its first agent, and this guy put in an application. Robert Ezra Park, he is also one of the fathers of American sociology. He is known for being the leader and the founder of the Chicago School of Sociology as we know it today. But before he went on to do that, he served as Booker T. Washington's special assistant and ghostwriter for 12 years. That's where he got his start. He wanted that job at the Phelps-Stokes Fund. However, someone beat him out for the position. Our guy, Thomas Jesse Jones. And in the archival records about how they came to that decision, they really liked the fact that he had this quantitative apparatus that came along with his research, and they felt that he was an expert in the American Negro, especially due to his relationship to the US Census. Jones had a prolific career. He did more things than I can account for during this talk, but I want to tell you about one of the first studies that he did. He became a philanthropic agent during this era of the foundation-funded study. We all know way too much about this because we as scholars have to support our scholarship through grants often, so we know that cycle. And as a social scientist, there's often a push to frame your research in ways to make it policy relevant. Well, that comes from a place. It originated here with these early studies. So the Carnegie Corporation funded what is known as the Poor White Study in South Africa, that some argue was the blueprint for what became the apartheid regime. Okay, the Negro in America study, also funded by the Carnegie Corporation, which is popularly known as the American Dilemma, yet another study that shaped American policy as it relates to race relations for decades. But way before those studies came about, the Phelps-Stokes Fund funded a study called Negro Education, a study of the private and higher schools for colored people in the United States, led by Thomas Jesse Jones. The Phelps-Stokes Fund brokered a deal with the United States government, Department of Interior, in exchange for $1 to create a relationship. The Phelps-Stokes Fund fully funded the study. They knew what their results were going to be before they even started. However, they wanted it to have the esteem of a national institution. So if you see here on the cover page, the study was published by the United States government, by the Bureau of Education. So it just put that official stamp on the study. If you're asking yourself why it was focusing on private schools, the short of the story is that white America was not feeling funding black schools with tax dollars, even though African Americans were paying into the tax system. So in 1917, at the same time that Negro Education was published, there were only 64 public schools for African Americans across the entire South to serve millions of children. So at this time, our country was really relying on private schools to offer any access to education to African Americans. Here's an excerpt from the opening of Negro Education. The educational result of manual training is even more necessary for the Negro than for the white, since the Negro's highly emotional nature requires it for balance as much as possible of the concrete and definite. The study recommendations called for more teacher training courses, theory and practice of gardening, simple manual training, neighborhood activities, and the reduction of foreign classes. It really, really bothered him when schools would offer Latin and Greek. So he wanted to see that eliminated from curricula. So this Negro education study mobilized the Hampton idea to fortify a separate and unequal education system in the United States and throughout the continent of Africa. Here I'm just going to give you a glimpse into my journeys through the archives for this research. I found this in the Rockefeller Archives in Tarrytown, New York. It is a transcript of a secret meeting. I don't know why you would have somebody transcribe a meeting that you want to be kept secret, but maybe they were leaving it for me to find. So this was a secret conference that was called an emergency meeting after the death of Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington dies suddenly in 1915. And he was the mascot for the Tuskegee, Hampton-Tuskegee model. So what were they to do now? And I say they because we know that this is a network of power brokers. And this meeting was discussing that transfer of power and what that would look like. Here are some of the main attendees in that meeting. H.B. Frissell was the president of Hampton Institute. We see Thomas Jesse Jones. And I want you to see that this was an interracial group of leaders, right, and thinkers. And this is what power looks like when it moves through institutions. So those same people whose photos I just showed, here is how they are showing up in interlocking boards. So you can see everybody here are also serving in board positions for these philanthropic agencies or on Black colleges and universities. And they get in an argument in the secret meeting because at some point they're discussing what Jones's findings for Negro education really need to be focused on. That's bad social scientific research, okay? And they get into an argument because John Hope, who was then president of Morehouse College, who you can read his discomfort in the meeting notes, he suggests perhaps we could just incorporate a little bit of science and literature into the curricula so we can develop a leadership class. And they quickly shut this down. The meeting ends with President Frissell saying, "To us at Hampton, the doing of the thing is the important thing. And what we might call the academic side is comparatively secondary." Okay? So Negro education is published. The Tuskegee machine, a term coined by W.E.B. Du Bois, starts to socialize these ideas by either buying news media outlets that they control or by co-opting existing Black-owned newspapers where they're putting out their own propaganda about the model. And we see a generation of conferences start to pop up around, this is called the Cap'n Springs Conference for Christian Education in the South. It really was just focusing on this question of how do we mobilize as missionaries, religious leaders, educators, business people, and everything in between to support and promote this Tuskegee model of education. No one was left untouched. So in reading through the report of the 790 schools that Thomas Jesse Jones surveyed for that study, I see that he visited Haynes Institute twice. And although he praised Lucy Craft Laney for her excellent administrative skills, for the important work that her school was offering to the Black Augusta community, he dinged her school because they said, but she focuses too much on this academic stuff. She's not teaching them for life, and she's going to set up aspirations for her students that won't be able to be realized in real life when they graduate. So this study really served as a Rolodex for where the funding should go. If you got a green light in this book, you were a school that was deemed appropriate to receive philanthropic funding. If not, then not. So we have lots of documentation of Black educators and educationists who founded schools trying to figure out how to get around this Tuskegee machine that seems to have a chokehold on Black education. Negro education was so successful that colonial administrators in Europe reached out to the Phelps-Stokes Fund and said, hey, can you all teach us how to do this? And they put together a commission to bring Thomas Jesse Jones out, where he conducts similar studies in East Africa and South Africa. He publishes similar studies for them and comes up with the exact same results. There was extreme pushback from Black Americans of the Black intelligentsia, but everyday Black folk as well who were just trying to get an opportunity through educational access. Here we have Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois, who both had their own platforms to be able to sound the alarm bells about what was going on. And I'm gonna close out by just reading you what Carter G. Woodson had to say at the end of his life about this whole saga with the Phelps-Stokes Fund. In the first place, its biased study of Negro education in 1917 catapulted Thomas Jesse Jones, its director, into fame as the greatest living authority on the Negro, and closed practically all channels of philanthropy for Negroes, except through Jones and Anson Phelps Stokes. Schools which concentrated on developing the power of the Negro to think and do for himself were not desirable and were classified as unworthy of philanthropic support. Many commendable efforts to educate the Negro were frustrated before they had a chance. Negroes with foresight saw the evil in Jones's method of Negro control, but for fear of losing what little support they still had, they failed to muster up sufficient courage to speak out. Okay. I want to bring this back to the beginning. My message with Battle for the Black Mind is that the battleground for the conscience of the nation is and has always been the school. As we reflect on the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education and the onslaught of civil rights laws that came thereafter, just think about how in one generation we have this erosion of affirmative action and this move, this subtle shift into diversity and inclusion, which is not tied to, not rooted in repairing harms that have been done to historically marginalized and oppressed groups in America, but more so just a more friendly, let's make sure we got a mix of faces in the room, okay? And now up until today, just last year, the Supreme Court decided on students for fair admissions versus Harvard and UNC, effectively abolishing affirmative action in college admissions. Okay, but it doesn't stop there. There are always spillover effects. In the same way that that battleground was fought out in the school system, we saw how it spilled over and helped to desegregate every other sphere of American life. What comes next now that we've banned, just even thinking about, even being able to discuss, consider, and factor in racial and ethnic diversity in college admissions? Just at the beginning of this year, the second richest man in the world, the CEO of Tesla, Twitter, and SpaceX, felt necessary to publish on his own platform that he owns on Twitter, DEI must die. That tweet got 35 million views. It was retweeted 250,000 times. Who were part of the folks who were retweeting? Some CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And we're seeing already the eradication of any programs or initiatives that have any semblance to DEI, affirmative action. So again, the pendulum has swung. The train has left the station. And we as educators, as scholars, as stewards of young minds, we gotta do something, y'all. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you. Thank you, Mom and Dad, friends. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Can I give you a hug? Thank you. So beautiful.
Thank you for such a lovely talk. It was really
thanks.
enlightening to see all the connections.
Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Does anybody want to offer a question? All right.
Oh, thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for that talk. I'm very much struck by, I guess, the kind of audacity of creating or endorsing a thoroughly unequal education system and then calling it charity. And then the way you kind of connected that to the sort of illegalities or challenges against DEI now. And could you say a little bit more about the role of social science or sociology in particular around some of those discourses or debates around the charity of industrial education and or the kind of social or educational dangers of DEI at the present?
So first, I'll say that words matter, right? And we see how words and the specificity of words and naming something for what it is matters a great deal in effecting change. But it's also extremely useful, okay, for conflating, confusing, and distracting a public from what's really going on. So as I shared in this historical case, we can see that, similar strategy being invoked today. So with the assault, the full frontal assault on DEI, they took the term diversity, equity, and inclusion, co-opted it, flipped it, and reversed it, and they're calling it didn't earn it. Okay, so sometimes it's just the co-optation of language that helps to reframe or persuade a public on how they're feeling about something. And I'll give you a couple of current cases where that didn't earn it is just set off like wildfire. So we all know that there's a certain airplane company that's having some issues these days, right? Doors falling off in flight and stuff like that. Well, there are lots of discussions on social media. Whenever that happens, you will immediately see a bunch of posts, must have been a DEI pilot. So, what? When the Francis Key Bridge fell just a few weeks ago, instead of a focus on the 6 lives that were lost on that collapse, instead of interrogating the failure of the boat system, what sucked up the conversation in the media about that bridge falling? The DEI mayor, who just happens to be a Black man. So the term DEI is now being co-opted as a euphemism for anything Black, anything that's a marker of difference, okay, and being co-opted to mean didn't earn it, to suggest that idea popping up in your head when you hear the term DEI. So that's like happening right now, and we're seeing it also run rampant through academia, where many Black faculty, especially Black women faculty, are being cherry-picked and attacked in the media and having the credibility of their scholarship challenged and being called DEI hires in the media. So even if those allegations and cases are absolved, that's now a part of your legacy, okay? That the enduring damage of something like that is irreparable. So those would be the examples that I give. Yes.
Thank you for giving this space. So, one of the things that I think has to be on the conversation is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court. Because, as you said with Brown, and this is only cases, the Supreme Court is what allowed the 1950s and 60s to become the civil rights generation.
Yes.
And 60 years later, it's being, I don't know if I want to say co-opted, but in a lot of ways, it's being used to take away all of those rights. It's not just race, but a number of rights. So the question I think on the mind, and I think a lot of lawyers have this question, is how is it that we can change the structure of the Supreme Court? I know that sounds wild, but change it so that it can't be used by presidents and so on and so forth for these ideological lenses. Because if you ask the American people, oftentimes the popular opinion is very different from how the legal structure is used within the Supreme Court. So I just maybe think about this from the legal perspective of, you know, how the constitutional rights can happen in this era.
I wish I had the answer to the appropriate action that would repair the situation that we found ourselves in terms of making a change or a mandate to the Supreme Court. I will say that it is clear that our Supreme Court has been politicized for some time now. And in the months leading up to the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC being brought up to the Supreme Court, the sitting president voiced a public opinion about how he felt that decision should go, kind of offering permission to the court, tipping his hand, which is unprecedented. Okay, so the decision comes down super fast. Legal scholars are having the many arguments about why that case even made it up to the Supreme Court. I don't have the expertise to comment on that, but my one vote as a single citizen, I do not think that Supreme Court judges should any longer have lifetime seats. That's one thing that I think as a citizen. However, I don't know how we then hold a Supreme Court judge bench accountable, because we've, as citizens, surrendered that trust to the courts. But with that social contract where we say, okay, we're going to trust you to be the last jury for the country, we need you to promise to never politicize the court. So they broke the social contract.
Do we have time for one more?
I was struck in your story about women and education institutions, and in pre-modern Muslim societies, a lot of the educational institutions that have survived for over 1,000 years, a lot of them were established by women who had independent inheritance and therefore access to wealth. So when you mention this, apart from the natural resourcefulness of women, where they could do this, did they have access to wealth or power, and what implications, if any, in terms of moving where we are today and women's role in that?
They had wealth, great wealth, in vision and in their freedom dreams. Unfortunately, not in their pockets. The thing I love most about this book is that it centers the stories of not just Black teachers, but Black school founders, Black educational entrepreneurs, all of whom are women. And I didn't cherry pick women. It's just when I went through the archives, I found that while the men had the bullhorns, and we know about Du Bois and Woodson and what the men who wielded great power and influence in the sphere of Black education, they had the mic, but who was on the ground doing the work? Who was setting up them schools? Who was training them babies, okay? And so no, they, in fact, tragically all, in the end, suffer a similar fate. They don't have independent wealth or resources. They do have great networks and access to power. Mary McLeod Bethune could call the president if she needed to. However, that wasn't enough to get her school fully endowed. It was always a gradualism, a philanthropic gradualism, $5,000 here, $10,000 to fix a building. I can't find evidence of one case of a school being endowed by a major philanthropy or donor who really loved and supported those schools. So what you have is these Black women educational entrepreneurs not only keeping the doors of their schools open, but they're exhausting themselves on the road begging through letters and meetings and traveling and this and that, and they all die penniless. They all die exhausted, okay? And for Charlotte Hawkins Brown and Lucy Craft Laney, their schools don't survive much longer beyond them. Once the engine of fundraising goes away through their freedom dreams and their vision, no one's able to pick up the mantle and keep those schools open. So they're both now still standing as museums. Thank you so much.